I must start with my thank yous and say thank you for inviting me all the way from Ahmedabad. Yadu, you've been fantastic in making it happen, and support. Thank you just for the space and everybody who runs this space with the kind of sort of energy that you do. It's so, you feel the energy when you walk into the space. So thank you guys for that. I'm happy to be here for another reason also, because when a museum speaks to another museum, we also build solidarities that are so important at the moment where we are in time. And for me, this is also a step forward in building that solidarity. So for me, this talk is important from that point of view. I'm going to share what I am going to talk about today. Generally, museums want to introduce themselves and talk about their collections and the great work that they do. But I want to talk about the possibilities of the pitfalls in the imagination of doing alternative work. On one hand, we commend ourselves for having alternative ideas. But over the years, the alternative has become a space to relegate certain ideas that, oh, you're the alternative type, and therefore you can occupy only so much space. Whereas the alternative potentially might want to imagine itself as the mainstream at some point, or at least that could be a form of a goal. And we look at the tensions of what are these tensions between the alternative and mainstream. But while I do that, I'll quickly give you a context of where I'm speaking from, and I'll try and sort of zoom out from Ahmedabad. But this is roughly the map of Ahmedabad for those of you who are not clued in. There's the river Sabarmati, which has become more like a nala because now there's Narmada water and a sort of very manicured riverfront project that's come there. And the river, in a sense, divides the city into two parts, into the old city and the new city. The Conflictorium is in the old city, and it's in an area called Mirzapur. The Conflictorium was inaugurated in the year 2013, and it's housed in a building that was donated to us by a Parsi woman called Bachuben Nagarwala. She was Ahmedabad city's first trained hairstylist who went to Bombay in 1942, trained as a hairstylist, came back and ran a salon in her home. When we received the building, she had died 3 years ago and she was 98 and she was alone. So the building was falling apart, and we took on the restoration project, and that's what the building looks like now. With actually, in fact, this was in 2013. Now we have full-grown kadam trees in front of it. And I just want to quickly go through what the museum does, but not really spend too much time introducing the museum. I feel like that's best done when and if you have a chance to visit the museum. What I do want to talk about is the reasons of setting a place like this up. Gujarat has had a history of conflict. When we were setting up the museum and doing some primary research, sharing these ideas and saying, hey, we're planning to do a museum of conflict, one question or one response that came up often was, but why are you doing a museum of conflict? Because Gujarat is largely peaceful. We have a Gandhian hangover, which doesn't allow us to acknowledge that we are a fairly violent people. In fact, Gujarat was separated from the Bombay presidency in the year 1960, which is when the state of Gujarat was formed. And that too happened as a result of a linguistic conflict between Marathi-speaking Bombay Presidency and Gujarati-speaking Bombay Presidency. There were bits of Madhya Pradesh also that then got separated out in 1960. And therefore, where do we even begin to acknowledge that we are a conflict-ridden society that does not want to talk about it, and therefore we've generated a sort of culture of silence. So it's meaning when given a choice, we would choose to sort of put something under the carpet and let it brew and ferment and then come out as these sporadic, violent events. And while these events have been unfolding in our contemporary history, whether they are in the form of student agitations, whether they are form of communal riots, whether they are atrocities against Dalit people, one of the things that has come back again and again is what is the nature of evidence that is produced to imagine this conflict and understand it. And if we just sort of think about what is really the nature of evidence, is somewhere between the two. We either talk about the weapons of violence, or what are the kind of tools that are used of violence, or what are the structures and frameworks through which a certain kind of violence is perpetrated, or what are the remains of that violence and how do we see it on human bodies. We've had examples in the past, and these are some mediatized images that have become representational of specific kinds of conflict. But the one before that is from 2002. This is from Una. If the Una sort of young Dalit boys were flogged in public. This is a more recent case of Hadia, and where the state intervened in the private lives of a citizen on her choice of a love affair or a marriage and her choice of religion. And I'm sort of wanting to look at these three specific cases also because what do these evidences reveal to us after we lose memory of legality? Because at some point your weapons rot or disappear, the wounds on a body heal, and with it very often an evidence is erased. If in Ahmedabad city we had to extend the idea of evidence in a way that was authentic, that was owned by many people and not only by those that bore the wounds of the violence, what could it potentially be? One proposition was that the museum, in a sense, would work with art practice in a framework of building evidence. I think that's one way of saying it, that one holds exhibition, one holds performance, shows film, engages with talk, but what are all these mediums doing? It's very, we often use a phrase that we are so comfortable in using now. We say art for social change. We use this very often. But how do we see art for social, art being either instrumentalized like it has been by left politics, of saying let's use art practice, but really how does this happen? What is the relationship with art practice and transformational processes? And when we started thinking of practice, and when I say practice, I mean all kinds of art practices, as a form of evidence building, we started seeing some of the museum started hosting exhibitions or curating exhibitions or performances that looked a little bit like this. And I'll walk you through the programming and the kind of work that we've been doing through thinking of them as evidence building processes. This was an exhibition that we curated called Imagining a Forest that was trying to talk about what is the relationship between urban lives and ecology, and what is the conflict or the fault lines between these two ideas. And this was part of the exhibition. Now, the question about representation is very often we will see that you have artists who want to talk about tribal lives, but how does an exhibition like this reach out to an artist who comes from a tribal space, who has a voice and does not want to be exoticized as a tribal artist? This is an artist who has contemporary politics and is making contemporary claims about what they think forest policies should be. So this is Matai's work. But simultaneously, in the same exhibition, you have APIL, that an organization based in Gujarat has filed, called Paryavaran Mitra, on the large-scale deforestation that's been happening around the Gir forest and that area. So one is placing APIL of this nature side by side Matai's work, or Raju Patel's work, who's from Dang, which is another tribal forest area in South Gujarat. How does our spectatorship change when both these entry points into this conversation are placed on the same platform? This was another exhibition called Pathbreakers, the 20th Century Muslim Women of India. This exhibition was looking at 21 women who had an incredible contribution to make in sort of pre-independent India that leads to the whole process of nation building, but we have no idea about. This was also happening at a time when the whole question of the Muslim woman's identity is in question. But how do we approach it? Do we come to it via the Triple Talaq bill, or do we come to it via breaking our stereotypes around how a identity is performed in public and what is informing that identity? This is Askari Naqvi singing or rather reciting something called Soz. He does performances of Soz Khwani, which are songs of lament and mourning, which are traditionally performed in religious settings during the time of Muharram. They tell the story of Karbala. And Askari performed this outside of a tazia, in, so to say, a secular space. Now, in Ahmedabad, which is a fairly segregated society, and I mean, you want to imagine segregation not as, I mean it with a severity, which means that Muslim children and Hindu children very, very rarely go to school together anymore. If you do find people like that, that will be an aberration. The cinema halls, the parks, the recreational activities are all segregated to a great extent. And there is no diktat. The only diktat comes from, meaning the formalized segregation comes in living spaces. But that translates and means that an entire community is ghettoized, and that project in Ahmedabad is complete. So Juhapura becomes the sort of glorified ghetto for Ahmedabad. So what is interesting about Askari singing sows at the Conflictorium is that something that a community does not want to engage with at all finds voluntarily wanting to engage with it when performed or when presented in an aesthetic form, or it finds an aesthetic politics. We had a room full of people from one side of the city, and when I say this, I in some senses almost imply that these are people from New Ahmedabad. This is a photograph from an exhibition that was curated by a photographer called Sudharak Olve. And this exhibition was called Contemporary Reiterations, the blue icon. And it's really trying to locate Ambedkar in everyday contemporary spaces. And this is a child who lives in the neighborhood, in fact. And therefore, the museum is in a locality which is poor but is mixed. So there are a large number of Devi Pujaks who live in that area, but there are also large number of Muslims who live in that area. And therefore, this area is also a disturbed area under the Disturbed Areas Act, which is an act that does not allow you to sell property to a member of another community without the permission of the sort of council. You need to get your paper signed to do this. So that's a little bit about Mirzapur, which also defines some of the politics of how people are present and how those numbers remain in a designed proportion. We had shown and hosted and curated the work of an artist called Roli Mukherjee, who had been painting on disappearances and half-widows in Kashmir for over 4 years. And we showed that exhibition first at the Conflictorium in Ahmedabad. Over time, she had never been to Kashmir and had made lots of friends over Facebook in Kashmir, and it was only most natural that we would take this exhibition of about 63 paintings to Kashmir. But Kashmir, that is every day facing a breakdown of infrastructure, it's a far thought that there would be infrastructures of exhibition. And so this was a old carpet factory that was burnt down, then used by the army as a torture center, and then by the 4th generation of that family was being sort of cleaned up and repaired, and it was a vast, like a large space of long corridors, and it was in this state, and we sort of requested to use this space, clean it up a little more, and took this exhibition called Two Stories Rumored in Branches to Srinagar. And this is a photograph from the opening day of that exhibition. Now, what I'm also, in a sense, trying to do here is to say that as much as it may become important to show work within the Conflictorium, but it also becomes as important to take some of these ideas outside of the museum building, because for us the ideas that we are talking about are urgent, and if the audiences are not coming to the urgency, then we take our urgencies outside of the building. Yeah, it doesn't look like a quintessential exhibition opening, but it was, and it also meant that the Conflictorium must be forced to imagine what its politics are and what was the need for us to take an exhibition of these paintings to Srinagar, where this is a reality. these representations are everyday life for them. When they were shown at the Conflictorium, they were met with disbelief, saying, isn't this a little extreme view of what may be happening in Kashmir? When these paintings went to Kashmir, the women responded with tears of identification of, that someone has been able to represent my life. It was quite a sort of overwhelming gathering with the artist present, that is Roli, in the purple. Oh, sorry, this is not a marker. Okay. Yeah. Moving from practice and the question of impact, because when we are calling ourselves a museum of conflict and we are talking about really lying somewhere at the intersection of art practice and conflict transformation processes, what is all this evidence towards? And it's a difficult terrain to justify, because when you have, sometimes you have say the languages that donors use, which is surrounded around impact. You have languages that the art space uses, that is around affect. What are the affective experiences of showing art that is trying to build evidence? And then you have the real lives of people who are either making this work or experiencing this work. And what does it mean? What does justice mean in a situation where most forms of justice are breaking down? We are at a time where it's pertinent to say that what is necessarily legal is not necessarily moral, and therefore justice assumes a new kind of meaning, where justice might not have necessarily a relationship with legality anymore. This is one of the permanent exhibits at the museum. We call it the Memory Lab. And these are jars and the tags. The jars are generally empty, and these empty tags, and visitors are invited to leave behind objects that they associate with a personal conflict. Because when you're at the museum, you're taken through political conflict, historical, social, but you also realize that conflict is not large and out there and distant, but you really stand at the center of conflict. And so this becomes the personal space of leaving behind. And people have left behind incredible objects and stories and have been very, very vulnerable. So in effect, this becomes some form of an archive of evidence of the kind of conflict that people are harboring within them, with no space to channelize or even put out there for another person to identify as my own. Sometimes there are such intersecting objects. And once there was a researcher who visited the museum, and they said, in the museum you're talking about such serious things, but if you look at this memory lab, most people are leaving behind stories of love. And that's not as serious as the process of nation building. And I'm aghast, because if stories of love are not serious enough, then what kind of a nation are we imagining in the first place? This is another exhibit at the museum. It's called the Saree Tree. There's a tree that caves into the building, and we leave behind little printed notes that say, I'm sorry. This comes roughly towards the end of the museum, or at the end of the walk or the tour. People often leave behind, not often, mostly leave behind notes of apology, sometimes to their near and dear loved ones, sometimes apologies to themselves. And every time we read an apology that someone's making to themselves, we feel like there is a small victory that has happened for the museum. Because the position of self-reflexivity, the position of looking at oneself as perpetrator and the one who has, and the victim, because we are not only one or the other, we are very, very often both. Really the notes do to make a commitment to the self, which for us at the museum every once in a while, I think we draw a lot of our energy from this exhibit. And coming a full circle of why do we really do this day in and day out, because it's a difficult process to engage with. It's not all celebratory like we imagine art, spaces of art could be. It's not. It's very, very difficult. It's torn because we are pushed to examine our own positions as a team that curates and thinks through these ideas. And how does constantly engaging with the idea of justice become a normative idea? How does it spread to, say, the children in the neighborhood? How does it spread to the large audiences or the audiences that come from New Ahmedabad, where their only engagement with, or rather their engagement with caste is completely invisible? Or the kind of gender and sort of the kind of diverse sexualities, how do we respond to these sexualities, even in something as simple as language? You know, these are questions that pass by, not only in terms of thought, but in terms of how people perform their identities, or audiences or participants perform who they are every single day. And so, for example, this is right outside the Conflictorium. We have a little open courtyard. The lane outside the Conflictorium, or that main road, has lots of bands. They were called brass bands, but a lot of the brass bands have moved to DJing. And they do wedding DJs on these carts. And one of the things that we had done was we hosted a band competition outside. So every evening we invited one band to perform. They sort of then we invited the radio to record and sort of air what they do. Suddenly they were so much a part of the neighborhood, imagined often their rehearsals as nuisance because they're loud, and they suddenly they were so integral to the sound landscape of this community, and they continue to be. Who accesses this building and this space? Not as much as we would like or we would hope, but at least we feel assured that the space is open, and once in a while people feel comfortable to walk in. We have school students coming into this space all the time, and there are wide eyes. And I was telling Subodh yesterday when I was at the Museum of Goa here, there were young people who came in and they had wide eyes and they said, "This is amazing." And those wide eyes and that phrase that this is amazing or this has moved me to think about something, is quite incredible. It's very special. So this is an artwork by Sara Naqvi, who talks about the body and body shaming. And these are girls who looked at this work and had responded to the effect of saying that we didn't know that, what our body does can be put out there and celebrated. We thought it has to be hidden away. This is a sanitary napkin that is embroidered with crystal beads and silk thread. This is what they're looking at. This was an exhibition on the Ambedkarite Shahirs at the Conflictorium, and these are the kids sort of listening to these Ambedkarite songs, and I take a lot of I feel very, there's some reaffirmation when I see sites of this nature at the museum, where you have, say, these kids who come in and they are audiences, but in the very next moment they also want to be producers. So they will come and say that we have to do a program next Sunday, please keep the auditorium free, and we want to do a program on XYZ things. And that is the kind of agency they yield as far as the building is concerned, or the ownership that they have. Meaning the struggle of going through through our everyday feels worth it. Now, coming back to what is the anxiety of doing this work, meaning I think I have, while I was speaking about what we do, I think I communicated a lot of my anxieties, but like I was saying in the beginning, there is a tendency to say that this is not, these are alternative thoughts. These might be minority thoughts, but they are certainly not meant to be in the sidelines. We would be very happy if ideas of really opening up the fault lines, acknowledging it and speaking out, not necessarily speaking for, but making space for those who need to speak their own stories, get opened up. And it always remains a tension of what do you lose when something becomes mainstream? What do you gain if you remain alternative? Yes, there is a immense power in remaining intimate, in remaining small, because you can do incredible things. You can make real human connections. We know our audiences by name, but there is a we reduce scale. We would ideally like to be able to speak to many people, but not at one place, maybe exist in multiple forms in different cities, but remain small. These are the kind of tensions of scale that we experience often. While we do this work and while we run the Conflictorium, this is the balcony of the Saree Tree. And this is probably, just by looking at the picture, I can tell you this is probably a picture from 2 days before the Rath Yatra, where the Rapid Action Force sort of takes over Mirzapur. That is the distance between two completely weaponized soldiers, and that distance is replicated for kilometers on two sides of a road. This is only a glimpse of what the state can perpetrate suddenly, overnight. And then to remain an alternative to the state becomes a complex idea. But we sort of continue to find little holes or little frames that are not clean, they are not perfect frames. They are sort of jagged at their ends, but we try and find a frame that might help us to look at both evidence as a process that we need to invest our artistic practices, our creative energies into, while we somehow find justice on the other side. Thank you.